Hello there. We're going to start in about a minute. Okay, Andrea, I just did something. Okay. Andrea, if you can hear me. All right, can we put up? I'm trying to see how we can share the source material. Okay. All right. Sort of getting used to the new technology. A little bit, everybody. Okay. David, can I ask you to just tell Andrea in the office to put up my source material, if you would? I don't know if she can. Andrea, can you hear me? Andrea, would you put up the source material, please? Thank you. All right. Ivan, how are you? Okay. Okay, we're going to get started in a moment. My usual practice is anyone who's been in my shiurim before is to start with a bracha, and then we'll get into our actual text. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshenu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Okay. All right. So, those who have the source material, okay, we're looking at this. We've been studying the book of Sefer HaChinuch, the book of Mitzvah education. And we've seen that it's not a Sefer Psak. It's not a code, okay? But instead, it's precisely what it's intended to be, a book that allows us to understand how it is that psukim, verses from the Torah, okay, eventually became part of a format of halakha, of Jewish mitzvah observance. Okay? We looked initially at the one example, and that was the first parsha of the Torah reading, the Breshit, but at the same time, we saw that the author has a certain pattern in writing each section. Okay, he presents what the initial verse or pasuk from the Torah is the basis of that mitzvah. He then goes on with some explanations, sometimes in more detail, sometimes in less detail. He then proceeds to share what the laws, some of the laws connected with that mitzvah is, and when that is applicable. Okay? So we're going to see that that is the basic format that he's chosen, right? Because he wanted to take the 613 mitzvot as listed by Rambam and divide each to the appropriate parsha of the week, with the intent that not only would people know how many mitzvahs are in each parsha, but also be able to get a sense of how do you make the transition. And that's part of what our study is together, from a pasuk to understanding basically the parameter of this particular mitzvah. Okay? And so, as I said, we had a chance to look at from Parshat Bereishis, okay, at the mitzvah of Peru Revu, and then we started now from Sedra Lech Lecha, the mitzvah of circumcision. Right? So I'm going to, again, if you, right, to see if Andrea can put up the, for screen sharing, the material. If otherwise, you hopefully will have a copy if you're here. Okay, I've picked it up. I don't know if she's on, David. If you think you can, again, I'm going to ask you to just to knock on the office door, all right? And see if she can, right? Okay. All right, so we began looking at the mitzvah of circumcision. What was interesting, we said, is that the author cited two different psukim in this case, just very briefly. One from the beginning, stating that this is my covenant which you shall keep between me and you and your descendants after you. Every male among you shall be circumcised. Okay, so that pasuk from found in Bereshit. Okay, but we said that one of the problems with that pasuk as a foundation verse for the mitzvah is it had no details. Okay, we would have to ask questions like when, at what point, who does it, who's obligated, things of that question. And so the author then brought a second verse, a second pasuk from Shmot, okay, and on the 8th day, the flesh of his foreskin shall be circumcised. So again, that second pasuk clearly defines the time frame, okay, and gives us a little bit more of a sense of what is expected to be done. Now, we then saw very briefly last week that he goes into some explanation. What he does in the Sefer HaMitzvah, it just simply lists it, Rambam. But the author of Sefer Chinuch then begins a short description of the actual surgery. So we would ask the question, why does that seem necessary? The implication would be that lest there be communities that perhaps don't have access to a moel, and if someone is in such a community, who would then know what to do to perform that kind of surgery? Okay. Now that may sound problematic initially, but remember, we're going to see in a moment on whom is that obligation. And that may then tell us an answer to why he felt it was necessary to include that part of the explanation. Okay? We saw then that aside from discussing the surgery itself, he then wanted to give a further explanation as to this, what I'll call the significance of circumcision. And here he cited a discussion from Maimonides from the Guide to the Perplexed. And I read the section last time, but I just want to very briefly summarize it by saying that he saw the idea of circumcision as a means of identification. One would identify with the Jewish people, with the values of the Jewish people, aside from the halachic framework of Judaism. And as a result, one would therefore also know that there's a certain moral expectations from one Jew to another. Okay? In describing that, okay, he also, as I said, although we did not read it last time, okay, points out that the Rambam in Guide to the Perplexed that it takes place on the 8th day. Why he suggests it be done when one is a child, okay? And in saying so, the Sefer Chinuch, however, does not discuss that, but instead raises another item. Why is it done on the particular place of the human body? And again, he suggests this time that because it is done on the organ of procreation, that this is the reason that it is designated there. And his answer is basically that that gives a person a sense of fulfillment, completeness, perfection. Now, why is that? He suggests the following idea. Okay? If you say that a person can improve themselves mentally, right? Through study, through Torah learning, through things like that. If you argue that in addition to that, a person can improve themselves physically, okay, through circumcision, then the implication that he's trying to derive is that an individual can improve themselves spiritually as well. So in addressing this issue, he wants us to understand basically that an answer to a question, why didn't Hashem create men, in this case, already circumcised? Could have done that. So his answer is because he wants us to see that there is this relationship between Hashem and human beings, that we help Hashem to improve ourselves, to make ourselves a better, if you will, more perfect human being, physically, intellectually, and we can do so also spiritually. So the author of Sefer Chinuch derives all of that from Rambam's Guide to the Perplexed as a way of trying to explain why it is that circumcision is done on the organ of procreation. Right. So having sort of summarized a little bit so far, we're going to continue now with his discussion of what some of the laws are. Clearly from the second founding pasuk that he put forward, to us, we saw a date, the 8th day. Okay? So naturally one would ask, well, what happens if the 8th day is Shabbat? What happens if the 8th day is a Yom Tov? Is one still expected to carry out circumcision? Okay. Let's say that one discovers that there's a illness to the child on that 8th day. Right? What are we expected to do? So the author of Sefer HaChinuch at this point, okay, tries to tell us the following. Okay? Some of the laws of the precept on whom lies the obligation to circumcise the young. In other words, who is obligated, first of all? Okay? He then goes into another example of circumcision, which doesn't apply to us today, but in earlier times, certainly in rabbinic times, and even perhaps in Middle Ages. Okay, if a Jew were to acquire a Gentile male servant, okay, question is he obligated to have that servant circumcised? We won't go into that now, but the second law that I do want us to come back to is, he says, in which circumstances the observance of Sabbath and festivals is set aside. Are there times when, even though the 8th day could be Shabbat or Yom Tov, it's not done? Okay. So what we begin to see is that he's going to have to provide us with some sense of if you will, sources, a basis for these laws. Okay? A third example, right, might be what takes place. Is it only the surgery itself, for example? What's said at the surgery? Is this an occasion for a bracha? Who says the bracha? Is it simply the person doing the surgery? Is it the person who's obligated? What about those assembled? Do you need a minyan? All of these are questions that naturally, now of course, we have a halachic framework, okay? But when the Sefer HaChinuch was written, excuse me, he was trying to educate people, to encourage them to either examine or become more familiar with that framework. But the question is, where did he get those ideas from? Right? So I want to share with you, okay, the case, for example, that in one situation, he clearly derived much of his presentation from the Gemara, from the Babylonian Talmud. And he excuse me, cites an example from Tractate Kedushin. And he says, Rabbi Judah says, all obligations of the son, which lie upon the father to do to his son. Men are bound, but women, mothers, are exempt. So he wants to give some examples. By the way, just a quick aside, among those obligations that the Talmud lists is that a father has an obligation to teach his son how to swim. Okay? You can imagine that in Babylonia, where you had rivers frequently, that was a major issue. Okay? But after discussing that, he says to circumcise him and raises the point, how do we know that it's the father's obligation? Okay? And he cites in the Gemara the following piece. Okay? Because it's written, and Abraham circumcised his son Isaac. And if his father did not circumcise him, the Beit Din is bound to circumcise him. So in other words, drawing from the Talmud itself, we see there's a series, if you will, of obligations. First on the father, then it has to be arranged by the local Beit Din. And what happens if that's not viable? And if the Beit Din did not circumcise him, he is bound to circumcise himself. For it is written, and the uncircumcised male who will not circumcise the flesh of his foreskin, that soul shall be cut off. In other words, okay, so good. All right, so now that we have our text there, we're on the top of the page, okay? We can see there, I'm going to here use the pointer a little bit, okay, where he began listing the laws, and that's what we're looking at. Because he then says, if you look in the Talmud, right, some of them are sections in Shabbat, in Yevamot, things like that. This one that I'm sharing now is from Kiddushin. Okay? So the implication is that the father has the initial obligation to perform the circumcision. Following that, the community, the Beit Din. Today, in our day, it would mean perhaps if a rabbi was aware that a person needed circumcision, and ultimately the person oneself. Okay? Now, having seen this as an example, he still hasn't really addressed some of the other questions that we may ask. Okay? However, okay, he does, as I said, then goes into the question, the topic, after telling us some of these other sources where he derived the material from the Talmud. What is to be said? And he tells us, he spells out in the text of the Sefer HaMitzvot, the Sefer HaChinuch, what is to be recited by the father. Now, what's interesting for our personal study is the fact that most of us are Ashkenazic Jews, right? However, the author here was primarily from a Sephardic background. So he cites the text that was apparently recited at a bris in his time in the 14th century in the Sephardic community. And so listen what he says for a moment. Again, towards the end of that paragraph, he says, the father of the child or the religious court says the following benediction, the blessing. Blessed art thou, O Lord our God, King of the universe, who hallowed us with his mitzvot and commanded us to bring him into the covenant of Abraham, our father. Okay? Now that sounds pretty straightforward, and really that's pretty much the language used at a circumcision today as well. And then he says those present respond with a certain statement, okay? And we find, of course, that basically today, right, our statement in response is a little bit different. We say, Kashem shenichnas labris, yikanes laTorah lechuppah l'masim tovim, as he entered the covenant, so he may enter a life of Torah, etc., etc. Okay? Now, what's interesting is that the author then decides, as I've said, dealing with some of the laws, he wants us to understand where is this applicable. Okay? He's already told us that it's obligation of the men. Okay? Therefore, women are exempt from circumcision of their sons. Okay? And that is, I think, a significant statement, because we could ask, well, why did he have to repeat it? If he's already told us earlier that the father is obligated, why then tell us that women are exempt? Okay. Well, the answer I'm going to suggest is twofold. Okay? And it comes back to the Talmudic source that we just cited. Okay? It says in the Torah, we said, the uncircumcised male, okay, who does not, if it comes down to that point, shall be cut off. I mean, he's subject to karate, to that punishment of what someone will explain as a death at an early age. Okay? Now, we might understand that that is a little bit surprising. However, in the Mishnah, okay, particularly in the section of Kodashim, we have a Mishnah that starts off a chapter called Kritut, those situations where someone would be subject to this divine punishment. And that Mishnah starts off, for 36 transgressions, karet is prescribed by the law. Now, most of those are then moral and sexual issues, where there is inappropriate relations. But at the very end of that list of 36, as I say, transgressions, we find the following. Or from among positive commands. There are two examples of positive commands that the Torah gives us, where if a person does not perform those mitzvot aseh, positive commandments, the idea would be that they ultimately would be subject to this divine punishment. One, laws of Passover. Two, the laws of circumcision. So there's an interesting, if you will, juxtaposition here between the idea that many thought, in a sense, that's what the reason was, that people who one could not invite non-Jews to one's Seder, okay, because of that requirement. Okay? Now, in any case, we can see that that's the case, all right? So let's go back. So having pointed that out, all right, we just want to then come back to his closing discussion then of the practice of circumcision and its application. And he says it's found in every place and every time. Okay? And again, he reviews the fact that if their father is not able to, the woman has no obligation, but it's up to the Beit Din. If no Beit Din, then the person oneself. Okay? And he explains karet, as we did, all right, just before. And then in his conclusion, he wants us to understand basically right, the following idea that, again, this association with karet but he concludes that discussion with his following comment. In all the Torah, he says, there is no positive command which, if ignored, deliberately brings a punishment of karet other than this and the slaughter of the Passover sacrifice. So he draws that from that example I said in Mishnah, Kritut, to point out to us that these are unique occasions. Right? So that, in a sense, helps us see that he has attempts to give us a framework, if you will, in his material to understand that particular mitzvah of circumcision based on those psukim. Okay? Now, I thought that since our first unit, if you will, talked about being fruitful and multiply, the first mitzvah in first parsha, and we now skipped a little bit to Lech Lecha, from giving birth to circumcision. I decided that the next mitzvah that we should examine is one that follows the, if you will, path of family structure, and that would be to make us jump to the portion of Yitro, okay, in the book of Exodus and Shemot, okay, and there we'll look at, for a few minutes, what we have left today, the mitzvah of Kibud Av Va'em, honoring father and mother. Okay? Now, you're going to say to me, but Rabbi, that's pretty straightforward, okay? That's right there in the Ten Commandments, okay? Why is there a problem with that? Or what issues could there be, right? What kind of discussion could there be there? Well, actually, there's a great deal of discussion, okay? Because again, what our author is trying to do is educate, not so much give the laws themselves. He suggests some of the laws. If one really wants to look at the laws, his attitude would be, well, sit down, study the Talmud, study Rambam's Mishnah Torah. Okay? We, of course, have more other books that we can look at. Okay? But he wants to give if you will, let's call it almost a kind of, I don't want to call it a cheat sheet, but I'll call it, sometimes when you took courses in the college, you also saw that they had little yellow books that basically gave you a review of how to read the book, what it was, its main messages, things like that. Okay. So I want us to begin, as I say, this third topic, of honoring parents. And now, as I said, we don't have to look hard to find the verse. That's our source. Clearly in the Torah, in Shemot chapter 20, honor your father and your mother. Okay? And here, the author of Sefer Chinuch uses a very interesting explanation. Okay? He tells us what is the meaning. Okay? It tells us clearly there were 3 or 4 clear, specific examples of how to honor father and mother. What are they? Number 1, to provide food and drink. Number 2, provide clothing. Number 3, to take them in and lead them out. Now, again, we would have to ask ourselves the question, on what does he base those? Where does he get that information? Normally, we would say he probably looks, first of all, into the Talmud. And indeed, if we look again in Kiddushin, in the Gemara, we find the following statement. Our rabbis taught, what is fear and what is honor? Now, why does that come up? Because if we all remember, there is one verse from the 10 Commandments that says, honor thy father and mother. Okay? But there is another verse also in Shmot that says, Ish aviv v'ira tira'u ve'et shabtotai tishmaru. That one should fear his mother and his father, etc., etc., etc. And so it's almost as if he's saying, well, you have psukim here in the same book of the Torah, fairly close to one another. One says honor, one says fear. Okay? Are they in conflict? Are they telling us to do the same thing? Okay. How do we define then the parameters, as what she's about to do, of these mitzvot? So it's easy for him to say, as he does, it's in the oral tradition. Okay, it's found in rabbinic literature. Okay, in the Mishnah, Talmud, in the Midrashim. But I wanted to share with you the actual source, briefly, from the Gemara, there in Kiddushin. Our rabbis taught what is fear and what is honor. Fear means that the son must neither stand in his father's place nor sit in his place. Not only that, nor contradict his words, nor tip the scales against him. That we could discuss at another time. Honor means that he must give him food and drink, clothe and cover him, and lead him in and out. So it's interesting that rather than take the entire section from the Talmud, he only chose, the author of Sefer Chinuch, to focus on that specific sentence to define honor, since that was the verse he's using as the foundation verse for this particular mitzvah. Okay? So we could ask ourselves, so what does it mean, those items, right? In terms of saying food and drink, that seems fairly straightforward. Or is it? Clothing? And what about leading in or out? Okay, again, we would have to look at another example in the Gemara. Our rabbis taught, he must honor him in life and must honor him in death. In life, one who is heated in a place on account of his father should not say, let me go for my own sake. In death, if one is reporting something heard from his father, he should not say, thus did my father say, but thus said my father, my teacher, for whose resting place may I be an atonement. that is only within the 12 months of his death. Thereafter, he must say, his memory be for a blessing, zichrono levracha, as we say, for the life of the world to come. Okay. So our example here so far is to say that there are certainly certain requirements, obligations regarding the performance of the mitzvah of honoring father and mother. Okay? So let's think as we finish up today in another minute or two, what kind of questions he's going to have to address in his explanation. For example, okay, if it says honor thy father and mother, does that mean that the honor of a father comes before that of a mother or not? Okay. Or let's take another example, okay? Perhaps the question is, if you say you have to feed one's parent, from whose money? If the parent has the money, do you use the parent's money? Or does it all have to come from the child's money? That's a second example. Right? And thirdly, okay, why? Let's ask that basic question. Why does the author of the Sefer Chinuch here present, and when he gives reasons, why does one need to show respect, to show honor to a parent? So those are some of the items we're going to explore as we continue with this particular mitzvah next time, okay? And I think we're going to see again, sometimes he will use sources from the Talmud to explain, and other times he will try to give his own explanation, partly perhaps based on Rambam's Guide to the Perplexed or the Mishnah Torah, or simply from his own perspective. So I want to thank you for joining with me today as we continue in our learning from Torah to Mitzvah. Thank you. Any questions? Okay, thank you. Yeah?